Chapter 6. Eccentric Neighbor. After school, the destined children and the newly freed student body burst out the doors and loaded onto the buses. But this time, Aaron was nowhere to be found. Lincoln froze as Aaron's other two minions walked past him, bracing himself, but to his surprise, they continued to the back of the bus. Lincoln grinned, sitting down next to Verona, and enjoyed the chaotic but uneventful bus ride home. Stepping down from the bus, they waved to their neighbor, who smiled back at the children as they entered their side door. The Destin family rented a small duplex located in a cul-de-sac in the silent town of Belvedere. The duplex was rented out by their eccentric neighbor, Sir Qureshi, who lived in the other half. Sir was a tall, thin man who stood about 6 feet 3 inches and had a bushy, long gray beard that masked his entire face besides his gentle and slightly sad eyes. All anyone seemed to know about him was that he looked to be somewhere in his mid-60s, and he only wore traditional Indian shalwar kameez, usually paired with an oversized knit sweater and a dark circular hat called a topi. In all the time the Destins had known him, Sir had lived there alone, and even though he had a car parked in the duplex's garage, they had never seen him step foot outside his property. All his food was delivered locally from Piggly Wiggly, and the occasional Amazon package would appear every once in a while. No matter the season, however, there would always be a few bundles of firewood brought to his doorstep every Wednesday without fail. He seemed to be an extremely private person, and the Destins could only recall 7 people ever stepping foot into his home. A plumber and his assistant when a pipe burst and flooded the kitchen, an exterminator who came to help with the termite infestation, one mysterious old woman who was always clothed in purple the 2 or 3 times she visited, and of course Jillian, Lincoln, and Verona Destin. The inside of his home was small and extremely sparse. Surprisingly, Sir's half of the duplex was much smaller than the Destins'. There was a kitchen with an old stove and a rusty refrigerator that appeared much too empty. None of the usual photos or restaurant magnets cluttering its front. Sir's home consisted of almost no decor besides one unique wall hanging. It looked to be a tanned animal hide, with Arabic words scrolled in thick black ink. The only other thing in the kitchen was a small, beat-up table, just big enough to fit 3 sturdy wooden chairs around it. He had one small bathroom, with a bathtub squeezed in it and a couple of closets filled with blankets, sweaters, and coats. There was a bedroom with a simple double bed and one old, painted green and white dresser with 3 drawers. There was a second, smaller bedroom that the old man had converted into an office, even though nobody had any idea what he ever used it for. There was a small desk and a black, tall, and thin filing cabinet that he kept locked. Finally, the living room, where one would normally find a Sir tending to his fire if one were so inclined to look for him. The old man spent hours sitting in his very worn but cozy brown leather armchair, complete with frayed thick stitching and unrepaired tears on either side of the headrest. It was positioned in the middle of the room, just in front of and facing a great big fireplace. Next to his chair was a small round table that always had a couple of newspapers spread out on it. Next to the table was a wood and brass stand that held cut pieces of firewood. Off to the other side sat a small tube television, which was always on, and tuned to a news station, even though he never seemed to be paying much attention to it. Behind the television was a bookshelf, with just a handful of what looked to be very old, dust-covered books, ranging from very thin to very thick. Finally, in the corner of the room was an old but very nice working grandfather clock. Sir did not have any art on the walls, pictures, evidence of a family on display, or even knickknacks sitting on shelves or other surfaces for decorations, aside from the Arabic words on the animal hide in the kitchen. Every time Verona visited her eccentric neighbor, his fireplace was burning, and he was always poking at it with a metal fire poker that had a decorated handle depicting the sun while the other end came to a dull point. It was not uncommon to have a fireplace in a Belvedere home. Belvedere had suffered through many miserably cold winters. However, this particular fireplace seemed out of place for this particular home. Everything in the house was small, old, beaten up, and unspectacular. So, it was a bit strange to see a very large and ornate fireplace positioned right in the middle of it. The fireplace was made of a beige stone that had been smoke-stained over many years to appear dark gray in color. It went all the way to the ceiling, and it was almost the entire width of the longest living room wall. The Destins did not have a fireplace on their half of the duplex. Beneath its thick oak mantel, and on either side of the fire, stood two great pillars carved in the shape and texture of two giant oak trees. Above the mantel were ornate designs that appeared to resemble tree branches, leaves, and woodland creatures. In the middle was a chiseled carving of a large crescent moon facing eastward, overlapping a sun with 8 large wavy spikes for rays, with 8 smaller spikes between each larger one, and then a carving of the earth set off to its right. In addition, it was also strange that regardless of whether it was the dead of winter or the hottest day of summer, the fire in Assur's fireplace was always burning, and their neighbor always seemed to be tending to it. Jillian had convinced Phil that even though their landlord was a peculiar old man, she believed her kids were safe around him. Although Jillian never voiced it out loud to Phil or anyone else for that matter, she knew from the first time she met him that Assur would protect her children with his life, if it ever came to it. She could not explain why she believed this so strongly, nor did she attempt to, but she felt that peace around him and was convinced that as long as her family lived in that house next to Assur Qureshi, they would always be safe.